Hello everyone, my name is Charlene, and today I'm going to be sharing with you all of the books that I read in the fall, part 2. So I mentioned in my October wrap-up video that I wanted to start doing quarterly wrap-ups and only do monthly wrap-ups for the readathons or read-alongs that I participate in. And if I read enough books in a particular quarter or particular season, then I will do this over 2 videos. And I very much read enough books in the fall quarter to need to do 2 videos. So this is part 2. And if you missed part 1, I will have it linked down in the description below. But in that video, I talk about all of the books that I read for my One and Done Sci-Fi Fantasy Challenge, and also all of the books that I read in the month of September. So in this video, I will be talking about all of the books that I read in the months of October and November. There are quite a few books here that I need to talk about, so let's just go ahead and get started. So the first book that I finished in October was Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers. And in this story, we follow Vera Wong, who is a 60-year-old Chinese woman who runs her own tea shop. Not that it's doing very well. She has one regular customer every day, and that's usually her only customer. However, one day she wakes up and there is a dead body in her tea shop. And so the police come in and they look at the body, they take statements from her, and she's kind of disappointed because she expects that this is going to look like a CSI episode. And then it doesn't. They get information from her, the ME comes in, they bag up the body, they take it away, and that's all she sees. And so she immediately comes to the conclusion that the police must be incompetent because they didn't do what she expected them to do. So therefore, she must solve this case. Alright, and sorry if I moved, but I had to let the cat in because he wants to go outside, but then he gets mad because it's so cold outside. Now, I will be honest, when I started reading this book, I was expecting from the reviews that I had heard to just absolutely love this book from the beginning. But I will be honest, it took a little while for me to get into, and I think part of it is because of the fact that I kept hearing people talking about Vera Wong thinks the police are incompetent, so she must solve this case. And when I started reading this, I thought, we don't see anything in here that says that. We see the police doing their job. She just doesn't see this playing out like a show she would watch on TV, which of course you wouldn't, because all the drama happening in a TV episode mostly happens behind the scenes to the people who are either related to the victims or are suspects or whatever. So I didn't really understand this whole thing about the police are incompetent. She has to solve it. Why? She really doesn't. But what I came to realize as I read this book, and sorry if this is a spoiler, but I think more than anything else, this is a story of a woman who really doesn't feel like she has much of a purpose anymore. Her purpose is mostly texting her son every morning, telling him he should already be up and going for the day, asking him if he has a girlfriend yet, and then running her tea shop where she has one customer every day. And while she makes that her purpose, let's be honest, most of us wouldn't find that to be much of a purpose. So I think that's more of the reason for her trying to take the reins on this, is because she's looking for purpose in her life. And if the police are incompetent, she now has purpose. If, like me, you've heard a lot about this book and going in expecting one thing and not getting it would potentially hinder your enjoyment, just know there's a little more to the story than that. But in the end, I did really enjoy this book. It is an extremely bingeable book. And if you like cozy mysteries, this is a really good one. Excuse you. And I think I forgot to mention this in my last wrap up, but I do include some information on content in the books that I read in my Goodreads reviews. So if you're curious about any of the content in any of the books that I talk about in this video or in part 1, I will have my Goodreads review linked down in the description below, along with a link to the book's Goodreads page. Alright, the next book that I read was The Mysterious Mr. Quinn by Agatha Christie, and this is a short story collection following really 2 characters. They're told from the perspective of a man named Mr. Satterthwaite, And in all of the stories, the character of Mr. Quinn does eventually show up. Sometimes it's earlier in the story, sometimes it's later in the story. But he does eventually show up. And he is a very mysterious character. We don't really know who or what Mr. Quinn is. But there's definitely something about him that is or seems to be not normal. In all of these stories, he talks with Mr. Satterthwaite about what Mr. Satterthwaite has seen, what he's observed, and tries to get him to look at the information a little bit differently than he already has. And tries to help him figure out, is what you think or what other people think happened what actually happened. I think there's 13 or 14 stories in this collection, which is basically all of the Harley Quinn stories except for 2. Now, the 2 that aren't included are The Love Detectives, which I also read in October, and the Harley Quinn tea set, which I reread in October. The Harley Quinn tea set is the last Harley Quinn story, or Mr. Quinn story. And I read that one years ago, but I left it feeling so confused, because if you don't know anything about these 2 characters, you're going to leave that one very confused. So I did reread it. It made a lot more sense the second time around, and I enjoyed it a lot more. The Love Detectives I really enjoyed. That one is definitely one of my favorite short stories out of all of the Harley Quinn ones. And there were quite a few in The Mysterious Mr. Quinn that I enjoyed as well. Really, all of them I enjoyed. I would say all of them got between 3 and 5 stars. So they are all good stories, just obviously some I enjoyed more than others. But they do have a different feel to them, mostly because of the character of Harley Quinn. I would almost liken Harley Quinn more to Miss Marple than Hercule Poirot if you're familiar with those 2. In that Mr. Quinn typically sits back, he's not really part of the action, he's not part of what's going on. He just sits there and asks questions. And whereas Miss Marple will sit and ask questions and gain information and then be able to say, this is the answer, Harley Quinn sits back and asks questions, leading Mr. Satterthwaite to figure out, this is the answer. So it is a little bit of a different spin. He is a very different character, but they are really fun stories. All right, the next book that I finished in the month of October, emphasis on finished, was Hawthorne's short stories, which are all short stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I specify finished because I actually started this book in, I think, either February or March of last year. So I decided in the month of October, as part of a weekend reading challenge, and I have a vlog for that. Also, I guess I haven't mentioned, I also have a vlog for mysteries that I read in October, in which I talk about Vera Wong and the Mr. Quinn stories. So that will be linked down in the description below. And my weekend reading vlog, where I worked on this book and actually finished it, will also be linked down in the description. But I decided to really work on this one and finally get it finished. And I think I had about 10 stories I still needed to read at the time of that vlog. So there were quite a few that I read. So if you want more information on the individual stories, you can go check out that vlog, because I give you the synopsis for those 10 stories as well as my thoughts on them in that vlog. But overall, talking about this book as a whole, I did really enjoy it. Now, this book is divided up 2 different ways, because you have the table of contents where it lists the stories by the collection that they were eventually published in. These were originally published in magazines and then later published in different collections. So the table of contents divides it up by collection. However, after the table of contents, it also lists all of the stories chronologically in the order they were originally published in magazines. And so I actually read through these in chronological order. And I will say this much. I really enjoyed his earliest stories. Those were some of my favorites. And I enjoyed a lot of his later stories. But the ones kind of in the middle were the ones that were more, they were okay. But just in general, he writes stories that just have a really interesting take on things. So even the ones that I didn't love, I still enjoyed the the ideas that he was kind of exploring with them, or just the way the story ended up going. If there was a bit of a twist, I enjoyed that part. So I would definitely say these are some of my favorite short stories as far as by one particular author. Again, I didn't love all of them, but I enjoyed a lot of them. The next book that I read was Honest Faith by Charles Spurgeon. And this one I read with a group of people on BookTube. It was hosted by Tiffany from Beautiful Minutia, Dia from Novel Idea, and Chrissy from Chrissy's Purple Library. They did live stream discussions once a week on this, and I really enjoyed the ones that I was able to participate in. And I really enjoyed reading this book as well. This is the first Charles Spurgeon book I've read. And from what everybody else said, it is a really good book, but he has other books that are better. So I am looking forward to reading more of his books. So each one of these is probably about 2 or 3 paragraphs long. Very short, very easy to get through as far as the length goes. But he does go into a lot of things of kind of the why we believe what we believe, why we believe the Bible is true, and different things like that. So it is a really good book if you want something to start with of his that is a lot shorter, probably a little easier to get through. But like I said, I am looking forward to trying another one of his books and seeing how it differs from this one. All right, the next one that I finished in October, because yes, we're still in October, was Until the Mountains Fall by Connellan Cosette. This is the 3rd book in the Cities of Refuge series. Each of the books are more companion novels, so we're following a different character in every book, and they typically take place a few years after the book before it. So this one I think probably takes place somewhere around, I would guess about 7 to 10 years or so after book 2. So the characters that we're following in this one were children in the 2nd book. And in this book, I have to look up the name, Rivka is recently widowed, and her father is a priest in one of the cities of refuge. And so she is betrothed to her late husband's younger brother, according to the Levirate law. But she does not want to marry her late husband's younger brother. He's, I think, 16 or 17 at the time of the betrothal, and she's a year or two older than him because I think she's 18. So it's not like there's a huge difference in age here. But this is the boy who tormented her as a child, was constantly picking on her. She just still has bad memories when it comes to him, and she wants nothing to do with him. However, he, named Malachi, again, I had to look up the name, sorry. He actually has liked her for quite a while. And at one point, he'd kind of stopped teasing her, but it wasn't long before she got, I was almost said engaged, before she was betrothed to her late husband. And he was starting to treat her better because all of a sudden he realized, wait, I actually like her. Like her. And so he was trying to treat her better because he was hoping to, at some point, hopefully win her over and marry her. Unfortunately, only about a few months after that, she was betrothed to his brother. And so he didn't actually get to marry her. He distanced himself from her. Now they're betrothed and she wants nothing to do with him. She ends up deciding to run away with another Jewish woman who is basically planning to go to a festival in another city of refuge. And then the plan after that is she's going to lose her cousins who are escorting her and go make a life for herself somewhere else because she doesn't want to marry the man that she's betrothed to either. And so Rivka ends up deciding to go with her. But she soon discovers that her city of refuge, the city that she lived in, was a whole lot safer than she realized, and she doesn't actually understand what to expect from the rest of the world outside of that city. This was a really interesting story because we get to see a little bit of the pagan cultures, but we also get to see more of the Hebrews who were kind of dabbling in pagan culture. The Hebrew law says, do not do these things, and there were some of them that were doing that, and giving into some of the pagan rituals and cultures to seem more welcoming to other cultures, to seem more tolerant of other cultures. So they were getting involved in things that the Hebrew law said they should not be doing. So we get to see a lot more of that in this book. And I really liked this story. I really liked the romance in this one. Honestly, the first book I really enjoyed. The second book was okay. This one I really enjoyed. So I was hoping to get to the fourth book in November, but it didn't happen. So we'll see if I can get to it in December. But I am looking forward to finishing out this series. All right, the next book is The Nightmare Virus by Nadine Brandes, also in October. And I do have another vlog where I read this book and the next book that I'll be talking about. So I'll have that link down below as well. This is a YA Christian sci-fi. And in this one, we follow a boy named Cain, who is living in a world, I think this is kind of supposed to be near future, where people have developed a technology that enables people to kind of go into a virtual reality, but they are basically asleep while they're there. So they inject a serum into them, they lay down in a bed, they go to sleep, and while they're there, whatever reality they want to dream about or live in, that's what they get to do. However, it ends up turning out that that serum got into their system and mutated into what is now known as the Nightmare Virus. And when people end up having it mutating and it takes hold of them, they have 22 days before they go to sleep and they don't wake up. So it's a series of you're gradually falling asleep for longer and longer periods of time, and you wake up for shorter and shorter amounts. So the first day you'll fall asleep for an hour, completely out of your control. You wake up, you're awake for 23 hours. You fall asleep again, you're asleep for 2 hours, then you wake up and you're awake for 22. And then on the last day, you're awake for 2 hours before you fall asleep and just don't wake up. And Cain and his brother Nole were working on a cure for the virus. They were hoping Cain wouldn't catch it because he'd only gotten the serum once, but he does end up contracting it. And we see this nightmare virus, this nightmare world, through his viewpoint. And there is a lot going on in this nightmare world. This is a really good depiction of the difference between the battle between the light and the dark when it comes to Christianity, between God and his angels and Satan and his demons, and the people who follow God versus the people who follow the world or who follow Satan, whichever way you want to look at that. So Cain is constantly finding himself being pulled. And so as the story progresses, Cain starts learning about the two sides that exist within the Nightmare Virus. And it does take a while to get there. I really liked the way this book played out. I love the way that things were covered. I do know a lot of people who have enjoyed her other books, especially her historical fantasy, did not care for this book. So you can take my opinion for what it's worth. I personally really enjoyed it, but it is a very different book from a lot of the others that she's written. All right, then the other book that I read in that same vlog, which again is down in the description, was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And this is a very different book. I made some comments in the vlog that people have called this a romance, and it is not a romance, it is a revenge story. I do stand by that it is a revenge story. However, as I've thought about it since filming that vlog, I feel like most people who talk about this book don't call it a romance, they call it a gothic romance. And that might be somewhat accurate. We are getting the story of two characters who, as far as we can tell, are in love with each other. However, that doesn't make it what you would typically think of as a love story. This is definitely a dark love story, a dark romance. And not even necessarily that... I don't know how to explain it without giving spoilers away. So it doesn't play out the way that you would think of a romance playing out. Let's just put it that way. So this is a framework story. We are starting in the future from when the main events of the story take place. And we're following a man named Mr. Lockwood, who is a new tenant at Wuthering Heights, or on the property of Wuthering Heights, on the estate. And he goes to meet with the master of the estate, Mr. Heathcliff, tries to get to know him, tries to introduce himself, and Mr. Heathcliff is just this very cold man. And after seeing him twice is just like, I don't want to see him anymore. So he starts talking to the head maid who lives in his house. Starts asking her questions about Mr. Heathcliff and Catherine and Mr. Earnshaw who live in his house, and trying to get an idea of what is going on with this family. And the maid is only too happy to comply. So she tells him the long story starting from when she was a child, growing up with the older Catherine and her brother and Mr. Heathcliff. And starts telling them the whole story of their lives, how Mr. Heathcliff became a part of the family, all of the different tensions between Heathcliff and the Earnshaws and the Lintons, and all of that. So I was a little confused when I started this one because I had heard somewhere that it begins in the future and then tells the story of the past. However, the part where I was confused was the Mr. Heathcliff, Catherine, and Mr. Earnshaw, because I knew the story was Catherine and Heathcliff. Like, that's the Gothic romance part, an emphasis on the Gothic. And Catherine's maiden name was Earnshaw. And so I was trying to put the pieces together of who are all of these people and how do they all fit together. Yeah, if you know that much going in, it does get very confusing. To somewhat clear it up, what you're thinking of as far as Catherine or Mr. Earnshaw. There are 2 different Catherines, and there are 3 different Mr. Earnshaws. So, it is going to feel confusing when you first go into this book. But I don't know that I'm necessarily in the minority, but I am on the side of I actually really enjoyed reading this book. And there was a point where I couldn't put this book down because I just wanted to know how it was all going to end. I will warn you that most of the characters are unlikable. So if you don't like books with unlikable characters, you probably aren't going to enjoy this one. I don't mind books with unlikable characters if they're supposed to be unlikable. If a character is supposed to be likable and I detest them, that's a different story. But if they're meant to be unlikable, I don't mind it. And the characters in here, the ones that are unlikable, are supposed to be. So that part didn't bother me, but it doesn't mean it wouldn't bother some of you. And yes, like I said, calling it a revenge story is fairly accurate. It is a story of someone seeking revenge, and you can decide for yourself when you read the book or if you've read the book, do you think that revenge was justified or not? If you want to know my thoughts, whether I thought it was justified or not, you can watch the vlog that I linked down below. I'm not going to give away any spoilers in this, and I know there are already going to be plenty of people who will agree or disagree with me on this, so I'm not going to delve into that. I covered it enough in the vlog. But the story as a whole, I did actually really enjoy reading. And like a lot of people say, enjoy might not be the right word, but I was enthralled with it from beginning to end. All right, the last book that I believe I finished in the month of October is The Message of the Prophets by J. Daniel Hayes. And this is a Christian nonfiction going over all the books of the prophets in the Old Testament. So Isaiah to Malachi. A lot of the things in this book are just kind of going over, this is what you're reading in this particular book. This is what it's covering. This is what it's talking about. And just kind of explaining some of those historical and cultural concepts that we might not understand today. Some of it goes a little bit more in depth and talks more about some of the words being used, especially if there's kind of a play on words. We don't get that from the translation, but if you were to read it in the original Hebrew, you would understand the play on words. So he goes into a lot of things like that. If you've read through the books of the prophets and you felt kind of confused about what they're talking about, or you just want more insight into them, this is a good one to pick up. All right, I believe these last 3, they're not the only books I finished in the month of November, but my one and done books, like I said, were covered in the previous video. So if you want to know about those, they're linked down in the description. But the first book that I finished in the month of November was Edge Dancer by Brandon Sanderson. This is a novella that takes place, or that is at least meant to be read, between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer. So books 2 and 3 of the Stormlight Archives. And this one follows the character of Lift. Now, Lift is a character whose perspective we get in one of the Words of Radiance interludes. I will be honest. When I heard that this book was from Lift's perspective, I was not looking forward to reading it. I actually did not care for Lift's character in the one interlude we got in Words of Radiance. I will say after reading this book, I like her a lot more. I have a lot more sympathy for her. I'm a lot more curious about her. And I do like her a lot more than I did just from reading Words of Radiance. I still don't know that she's one of my favorite characters, but I do like her better. Then the next one that I finished was How Do You Live by Gensaburo Yoshino. I think is how you say that. And this is translated from Japanese. It was written in the 1930s. In this book, we follow a boy named Copper, or at least that's his nickname. He's in middle school in Japan. Honestly, this book is a lot about him developing friendships with some of the kids in his class and just kind of learning a lot of things about life. It's also interspersed with journal entries from his uncle, who is writing a journal with different thoughts and ideas in it that he knows he's going to want to share with Copper one day. And so he's writing them down in a journal to eventually give to Copper. So we do get those periodically throughout the book, about every other chapter. And a lot of these entries delve into a lot of historical or scientific ideas. And then the narrative itself is following Copper basically as he's living his life. This is very slice of life. Now, I was reading this as part of a traveling book club. Tiffany from Beautiful Minutia started this, I think, on her Patreon. So we're passing the book around, mailing it to each other, and taking turns reading it and taking notes in it. And from the notes that I've seen, it seems like a lot of people either like the narrative or the journals, but not both. And I think most people like the narrative, but not the journals. I actually really enjoyed both. So I'm in the minority on that one, it feels like. But just overall, it was a really good story. Are there some things that are mentioned in here that I don't necessarily agree with? Yes, because these are Japanese characters. They live in a different country from me. They follow a different religion than I do. So yes, there are some things that come up where I'm personally like, I don't see eye to eye with that. I don't believe the same thing that you do. But there were a lot of things in there that I did like and did agree with. It is a very different story. And I know not everybody is a fan of slice of life. Not everybody is a fan of really delving into historical and scientific ideas. I'm one of those weird people who is. So if it sounds of interest to you, I would recommend picking it up. But I do also understand it's not necessarily the type of story that's going to be interesting to everyone. Hello, Editing Charlene here, because I just realized that I forgot to include a book in this wrap-up, as if it wasn't long enough already. But I also, in the month of November, read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. And this is kind of a story within a story. Actually, I shouldn't say kind of, it is. But in this story, we're following Gilbert, who lives in this smaller town where a new tenant has moved into Wildfell Hall. And he's wanting to get to know about this tenant. Everyone in town is curious about her. And as he tries to get to know her, starts to develop feelings for her. But there's some things about her past that she doesn't talk about. Things eventually come to a head, and she gives him some of her diary entries for him to read. And at that point, we go to the story within a story, and we're reading through her diary entries that she gave him. And once we get to the end of the diary entries, we go back to the story from Gilbert's perspective. Overall, I really enjoyed the story. There were some things, because yes, this is a bit more of a romance. There were some things with the romance that I wasn't as keen on, mostly in the latter part of the book. And there are a lot of characters, mostly in the middle section with Helen is the tenant's name, with Helen's diaries, that there's a lot of characters that you really don't care for. I do find it interesting reading this book so soon after reading Wuthering Heights and seeing the fact that both sisters ended up exploring the idea of the effects of alcohol and alcoholism on the characters in their story. This isn't surprising if you know the story of their brother Branwell. But it was interesting seeing these two different viewpoints. And not really two different viewpoints, but just these two different stories from two different sisters exploring the same idea, because it was something that they both had to live through. But I will say one of the things that Anne Bronte does very well in her books is interweaving her faith into her stories. Probably more so than I saw with either of the other two sisters. Now we will go back to past me. All right, and then the last book that I finished in November, I literally finished on the last day in November, and that is The Women by Kristen Hanna. And I think most people have probably heard about this book by now. It came out earlier this year. Everybody has been reading this book because Kristen Hanna is really popular here on BookTube. And for good reason. But this book, in case you're not familiar, takes place during the Vietnam War. We're following a girl named Frances, who goes by Frankie. She has grown up in Southern California as part of a very wealthy, well-to-do family. But her father and her father's family have very much put a strong emphasis on the men in the family join the Navy, they go to war, they fight for their country, and her father has a hero's wall in his office where there are pictures up there of every person in the family who has served in the military. So her father is up there, her grandfather, her great-grandfather, and so on. At least as far back as they have pictures. Or they might have like some of their papers or something like that if they don't have pictures. And so Frankie's older brother, Finley, enrolled in the Naval Academy and joined the Navy. The only way women in the family end up on his wall is if they get married. So Frankie ends up deciding she wants to sign up for the military and serve her country as well. And that she would rather end up on the wall for being in the military than for getting married. So she tries to enlist in the Navy, and they won't take her. So instead she enlists in the Army. Unfortunately, her parents aren't excited about this as she thought they would be. But she's already signed up, and so she goes through boot camp, she goes to Vietnam, and she serves over there as a nurse. And this book follows both during her time in Vietnam, which takes up about half of the book, and her time after she comes home. Because not only does she not necessarily get the welcome from her family that she was expecting, she doesn't get the welcome home she was expecting from her country. Because if you know anything about the Vietnam War, you will know the soldiers were not treated well when they came home. And so she's trying to adjust back to civilian life while also feeling like people are angry with her for having been in the military and for serving at Vietnam. And also a lot of people don't believe that she was at Vietnam because she was a woman. And people keep saying women didn't serve in Vietnam. And apparently this did happen for a lot of women who did serve in Vietnam, mostly as nurses. So Frankie does have a really hard time adjusting to Vietnam in the first place and then adjusting to being back home. And it is a really hard story at times. And I will warn you up front, the parts in Vietnam are extremely brutal. They get quite graphic. So just know that going in. But this was a very brutal, bloody war. So that's why it's pictured the way it is. But I know there are a lot of people who are not comfortable with much in the way of violence and blood and gore. So just know that before you decide to pick the book up. But overall, I really enjoyed this story. Alright, I think that's all I have for this video. I think that is long enough. So if you read any of the books that I talked about today, let me know what you thought about them down in the comments below. Also, let me know what were some of your favorite books from the fall quarter. So September, October, November. Other than that, I hope you're having a wonderful Christmas season, and I'll see you later.